Well, it's great to be back at Duke, and I have to thank Edward and Bob and my good friend here, Claire Conceição from graduate school, for helping pull this together and bring me back to Duke, as we may have called it in our era sometimes, the Gothic Wonderland. I don't know if they still call it that these days, but I do remember that from my era at Duke. Like Edward said, I was a math major at Duke. I don't think I knew sociology existed. I took some great religion courses. I remember taking New Testament and Old Testament, and Jewish mysticism was one course that was great, ethical issues in the life cycle. So I took some great religion courses, but never in a million years would I have thought that, fast forward to the future, I'd be back here talking as a sociologist of religion. So it's great to be back and to be here today. So today I'll talk about the findings from my book, Living Faith, Everyday Religion and Mothers in Poverty, about the role of religion in the lives of urban mothers in poverty, and then conclude at the end with some thoughts about public policy, and then again some reflections on how my own faith experiences have shaped some of the questions that intrigue me as a sociologist of religion. So although there have been countless studies in sociology on mothers in poverty, mothers on welfare, there's been surprisingly little until now, almost no attention paid to the role of religion in their lives. And this is particularly surprising given the 1996 welfare reforms law emphasis on religion as a tool for aiding people in poverty. So in my talk today, I'll try to let you hear a little bit about these women's experiences, try to let you hear a little bit in their voices, because wanting to share their stories really drove my interest in writing this book. So by way of introduction, I'll tell you about a woman named Maria, which is a pseudonym. All the names that I would use would be pseudonyms. But Maria, when I interviewed her, was a 24-year-old unmarried mother with 3 small children and a highly religious Pentecostal. She prayed many times a day, she read the Bible, she followed all of her religion's precepts with regard to things like not wearing pants and makeup and jewelry. Previous co-workers had asked many questions about her religion because of her noticeably different lifestyle. Yet for all of the importance, obvious salience of religion in Maria's life, she didn't currently attend church at the time that I interviewed her. She used to be deeply involved in her Hispanic Pentecostal church and attended services weekly, where she received a lot of practical support, food, help in housing crisis, as well as spiritual and emotional support. But after moving in with the father of her 3 children, she was no longer welcome at her conservative church. She occasionally visits her old church, but she's not welcome to attend regularly. She and her family had also become homeless and moved to a family shelter far from the vicinity of her church. And Maria said, she told me, the times that I want to go full-time to the church, it never works out because it's too far, or because me and my husband, that's what she called her significant other, me and my husband are not married, or because of my kids. Thus, she currently was practicing her faith in an individual way, isolated from a religious community. I interviewed Maria as part of my research on the role of religion in the lives of urban mothers in poverty. She told me her experiences as we sat in the small apartment in the family shelter, her toddler dribbling grape juice as he was playing with my little baby at the time. Her story presents several paradoxes. One, here's a woman whose deep traditional Christian faith is a defining part of her life, but she is separated from a religious community. 2, she has pressing needs that could in part be met by the spiritual, emotional, and practical support of a religious community. And 3, although she's not currently part of a congregation, religious life shapes and pervades the way that Maria responds to challenges, parents her children, and makes meaning of her difficult circumstances. So I didn't set out to write a book about the role of religion in the lives of mothers in poverty. Originally, I was intrigued by the aftermath of the welfare reform law, and I was interested in exploring really just the connection of faith and work for low-income women. But what really struck me when I was interviewing women was how deeply religious many of them were, but they weren't involved in church communities for the most part. Personal faith often played a defining role in their daily lives, but organized religion played little to no part. So I changed the topic of my research to look more broadly at faith in daily life, because although these women weren't part of a faith community, they spoke repeatedly of how much they relied on prayer in helping them with their many challenges, finding a job, finding an apartment, trying to keep their children safe in dangerous neighborhoods, and trying to make sense of the difficulties that they faced. Studies show that the lives of religion and spirituality remain high in many Americans' lives. 7 out of 10 Americans say they find purpose and meaning in their life because of religious faith. So given figures like that, you might expect that faith would play a strong role in the lives of very impoverished, struggling women. But no one had ever really looked at this before, which is surprising. So my research is part of a growing body of work of what's called everyday religion, and I'm sure they talk about this at the Divinity School. Looking at religion in terms of, as historian Robert Orsi says, the domain of everyday experience and practical understanding. So this entails a fundamental rethinking of what religion is, as Bob Orsi says, and what it means to be religious. Religion comes into being with an ongoing dynamic relationship encounter with daily life. In this way, traditional ways of measuring religiousness, like church attendance and surveys that look at religious adherence, miss a lot of actual everyday religion, which can go unanalyzed. And finally, Martha Frederick, who's an anthropologist, I believe she got her PhD here at Duke, but she contends that social scientists, of which I am one, emphasize race, class, and gender when they're understanding how people navigate their worlds, but they often neglect spirituality completely. And she says, among the faith-filled, faith in God navigates how individuals respond to almost all of their life circumstances. So if you're studying these individuals without looking at religious faith, you're missing a big part of what it is that makes them tick and helps shape their understandings and both motivates and sometimes constrains their actions. So the purpose in writing this book, like I said, one is telling the stories of the lives of these women that I interviewed, and two is further developing theory about religion and poverty, and I'll be talking more about that first piece today. So in terms of how I did the research, I did in-depth interviews with 45 low-income mothers around the Boston area. Almost all of them were single. They all had at least one child, age 6 or under, because of my original interest in welfare reform and figuring that welfare reform laws impacted people who needed childcare more with the new emphasis on the need to work. They were of a variety of racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. Most had some Protestant or Catholic religious background, although it was often very nominal, and a few had no religious background at all. However, 2/3 of them describe themselves as having high personal religiosity, praying every day, reading scriptures, but only 7 of the 45 attended religious services even once a month or more. I mean, I set a pretty low bar for frequent attendance at once a month, and only 7 of the 45 were even that involved. Most didn't attend at all, or maybe occasionally like as a guest on a holiday. Later, I interviewed pastors working in poor urban areas, and I interviewed 15 Protestant and Catholic pastors who have worked in poor urban areas to get their perspective on the things that the mothers were telling me. So just some framing comments. One, to start out, it's important to realize the importance of motherhood in these women's lives. Very central. Other researchers had written about it, but I stumbled on it quite by accident early on. When I started this research a long time ago, my youngest child was a baby. Many interviews took place in the women's homes, including apartments and family shelters. And so one day my own babysitter was sick, and I had my research assistant, who always came with me to watch the person who's interviewing, its kids. I just brought the baby along to be watched with all these kids. Completely changed the tone of the interview. All of a sudden, these women saw me as another mother trying to figure out how to balance work and taking care of children, not some academic researcher. Women began to offer me child rearing tips. Even though these women were probably half my age, some of them, they would offer tips in child rearing. One 17-year-old, I remember her very clearly, kind of shy, quiet, Latina mother, talked to me about how to feed the baby and get the baby to sleep through the night. One woman, she was about 21 years old, maybe, a young, white, non-practicing Catholic. She ran back to the back bedroom of her apartment in the family shelter to get me this children's video that her child had outgrown. Said, "Here, take this for your baby." And I hesitated internally at first because I thought, I can afford to buy this, and she lives in a family shelter, and other mothers could probably use this, but I did accept it graciously, and I really think that put us on a different footing with something to share with each other, not just academic researcher and homeless shelter dwelling woman. So, not that I pretend at all that I know what it feels like to walk in these mothers' shoes. I certainly don't. I don't pretend that shared motherhood erases issues of race and class, but that with my son along on the interviews, and he came on many of them after that, it did change the tone so that we had a common experience, I will say. Another sort of framing comment is this notion of partnership with God. I found this running throughout the themes of the interview. Psychologists like Kenneth Pargament, who study mostly non-poor people responding to illness or natural disasters, find that people are more likely to turn to religion in times of crisis, when events seem most out of control. This would certainly describe how many urban mothers in severe poverty feel. And I found it to be very prevalent way of framing their problems, this notion of working in partnership with God. So not as maybe Karl Marx would describe as an opiate of the masses, deluding them of their reality, but this notion of working together with God to try to forge ahead and to stay resilient in the face of hardship. So Maria told me how she worked with God when she lost her housing, when she became homeless. She said, "When I had nowhere to go and I would ask, God, please, if you're not doing it for me, do it for my kids. I don't want my kids to be sleeping in a car." I never got to that point because God was always there to help me. So Maria perceives that it's her partnership with God to get results, that God put it in her mind to ultimately go to the government and ask for help and to get on a housing list, etc. So although the women are the ones taking actions, filling out job searches, filling out housing forms, trying to form ahead, they perceive the partnership and divine assistance with God working together as to bring results. So it's not just passively waiting on a divine being, but rather prayer yielding hope and perseverance and strength to go on to take action. So in this first part of the talk, I'm going to be focusing more on the ways in which women engage religion positively as forms of resilience and interpretation. Later in the talk, I'll talk about some ways that they also engaged religion and faith in ways that didn't seem to me to be helpful. In keeping with other studies of non-poor people, these women more often engaged religion positively than in less positive ways. But it definitely was not unanimously in positive ways. So with that background, I'll turn briefly to three particularly important sites of daily life for mothers in poverty. The first being work and welfare, decisions and experiences with work and with welfare. The second being parenting, because motherhood was so central to who these women felt that they were. And finally, making meaning out of suffering. So to start with work and welfare, welfare has been intimately connected with issues of morality in the US in recent decades, certainly with welfare recipients being viewed as people perhaps living a cultural pathology of laziness. So it's not surprising that poor women make connections between religious beliefs and attitudes towards welfare. Most of the women I interviewed believed that however they wanted to frame it, I left it pretty open when I was interviewing them, but either God, their church, their religion would view welfare. And they thought that religion, God, church, their congregation, if they had one, would view short-term welfare use while they're getting on their feet positively, but would feel negatively about long-time welfare use. So one woman, a woman I called Rhonda, an African-American single mom who attends a Baptist church once a month, and she had previously been on welfare before getting a social service job. She told me God and her church would view short-term welfare use positively. But then she said, but people not trying, I think the church would shun them. For people making welfare their career, she said, God made somebody think of welfare reform, which I actually thought was pretty interesting. The divine architect thinking of welfare reform in her mind. And she said, and it helped, because you don't have people making a career out of the welfare system anymore. A minority of my respondents thought that God or religion, however they wanted to express it, disapproved of any welfare use, no matter what the reason. So a white Catholic mother who was on welfare said, God would think I'm a bum for not working. She said, I feel guilty when I think about religion and taking. Like having Sunday, the Sabbath day, to rest for prayer and thankfulness. She says, I feel bad. And I feel like even when I go to church, I'm not doing anything for myself, so I don't belong there. That's how I feel. And she goes on to tell me, she looks around and imagines all the other people in the congregation are not, that they're self-sufficient, and that she doesn't talk to anyone she goes because she feels embarrassed, even though no one would even know she was on welfare. But she feels like she's a bum and that she doesn't belong there. So interestingly, in an era of working motherhood and welfare reform, about a third of my respondents thought religion disapproved of working mothers. Whether or not they agreed. Some of them agreed with this and some of them didn't agree with this. But more actually thought that God would disapprove of working mothers than would disapprove of welfare, which is not what policymakers who want to draw on religion to promote work habits would want, certainly. One woman told me, it's a white evangelical mother of 4 who lived in a family shelter. She was one of the few married women in my study. About 3 people were married. She was one of them. And she said, God ordained it that the mother should be with the children, raising the children, not somebody else raising the children. I think God would rather have a mother be on welfare and stay home and raise her child, because that's the most important thing, the mother raising the child. So, that's, again, certainly not what policymakers would want to hear who partner with faith-based organizations to help move women from welfare to work. But given welfare time limits, most of these women will work. So I was also curious to see how religion, if at all, entered into their work lives. Because studies on higher income individuals have shown that religion imparts meaning to work, that there's not a huge relationship between religion and economic behavior. Sociologists since Max Weber have been looking at this, but that religion can provide a sense of meaning and purpose and vocation in one's work. And survey data shows about a third of working Americans think a great deal about how to link faith and work. But most of these studies are on higher income people than the people that I was talking to. I found 2/3 of the women I studied to connect faith and work. And remember, only 7 of them, even attended religious services. So a high percentage wanted to figure out how to connect their faith and their work. And the most important way that they did, the most common way that they did, different from the higher income individuals in previous studies, was survival. Like literally, God help me when the customer is screaming at me. God, get me through this day. one woman, this young 17-year-old young mother who was talking to me about her job at Toys R Us, where she had a seasonal job. And she actually was trying to relate. She doesn't attend religious services. She said, this is what I pray. She says, oh God, please help me. Help me through the day. Help me to survive the day. She says, I usually work with customers, and that's not easy. You have to ask God for help. When people have a bad day, they take it out on you. Another woman told me, I wanted to rip my boss's head off, but I would take out some time in the bathroom just saying, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. So women found faith to be a powerful tool in helping them to cope with difficult customers, rude customers, difficult bosses, difficult tasks, and to complete the work they had to complete. And, I have to say, if ever I have to, like go to a store, Target, one of those kind of stores now, I really hear these women's voices echoing in my head and wonder, like, wow, are the people that work here, having to pray like this to get through their days? A sizable minority of the mothers I talked to connected their faith with ethics in the workplace, as studies show higher income people do, things like not stealing, not lying, things like that. So a woman, a white evangelical woman I called Peggy, who no longer attends church after they were unsupportive during her divorce. She stopped attending church. She explained how faith kept her honest, she believed, in her previous house cleaning job. And she said, you feel a lot of temptation to do bad things, to help yourself to people's things, or just do a slipshod job cleaning and take the money and run. And she said, I never wanted to do that because I knew God's eyes were watching me. I wanted to please him, and I felt God's eyes were watching. She said, I would never touch people's things or give them less than what I had promised, because I think that God put that in my head, and that's what God wants me to do. So there were some other ways that people integrated faith into their work lives, but far and above the most common way was this notion of survival. Next, I will say that women were not thinking in sort of a big structural position. When I asked, as a matter of fact, what religion or God might require of supervisors or of employers, only one person said decent wages and benefits. It was all with some formulation of treat me nicely. So not necessarily thinking in a large structural sense, but definitely a reliance on faith to get them through the day. Parenting, I'll just talk about very briefly. It's an important site of everyday religion. Parenting is challenging under the best of circumstances. And general studies on higher income populations show that parents look to churches, to provide a moral community for their kids, to show their kids values, to involve their children in traditions, to teach to reinforce morals and values. And this was true of the women I studied. But above and beyond this, the women that I studied really wanted to draw on religious faith and to some extent religious communities to imbue their children with self-confidence, to help them feel like they would never be alone, to help the children know that God would always be with them. And they think that religious faith will enhance children's sense of self-esteem to resist peer pressure, which higher income people do too, but without as strong. Some of these women I interviewed had younger children and also older children who had maybe perhaps gone the wrong way on the streets, and they really felt a strong sense that faith will help us save our children. And in fact, even though these women didn't attend religious services themselves, many of them found a way to send their kids to church with others, which is pretty interesting, right? And one pastor I interviewed, a couple of the pastors I interviewed, confirmed that in their congregations, maybe up to 50% of the kids were there unaccompanied by parents. They'd find an auntie or a neighbor or their mother, someone to get these kids to church, even though they didn't feel welcome there themselves, for reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's one mom. this was very vividly illustrated in her case. This woman named Vicky, I called her Vicky, a 34-year-old Catholic who tried to return to Mass after a long stretch of drug addiction and recovery. But sadly, when she went, the priest's homily made her feel stigmatized and unwelcome. She said, "I made a stab at becoming a practicing Catholic a couple of years ago, and I went to church. There was a visiting priest, and he denigrated drug addicts, single mothers, people having sex out of wedlock, and nullified me. Every single thing I've done," he talked about that day, "and I left church feeling that big." So later, Vicky spoke to the regular priest at the church who told her God forgave her and that she needed to forgive herself, but she still feels like poor single mothers are looked down on and unwelcome and doesn't attend, despite very high levels of private religiosity. And what's particularly ironic is she knows a lot of the congregants because she goes to a food bank every week and at the church. So she knows a lot of the volunteers, she likes a lot of people in the congregation, but she doesn't feel welcome to be part of the community. So she particularly asks for God's help in raising her son. She said she grew up with 2 alcoholic parents, and she told me, "I ask God for help a lot. I don't know the right way to parent. I know the wrong way. I've seen the wrong way, and so it's hard for me sometimes. I second guess myself a lot." She said, "I'm very insecure about it, but I do what's right in my heart, and I ask God for guidance so that I can give this child what he needs." So she draws on faith, and she even talks about seeing God as a co-parent in her parenting and really drawing on God in this role of helping her to parent her child. So I don't think I'll talk any more about parenting. I think I'll look at this issue of making meaning. Certainly an important issue, theodicy for theologians and, the classic social theorists as well. Looking at how religion functions as an interpretive framework to make meaning out of suffering. And this is not something I directly asked people about in interviews, but over half of the women offered that unasked. From mostly Christian backgrounds, even if it was nominal, they had some Christian training. They drew on Christian narratives of divine will and redemptive suffering. None of the explanations they offered are limited to people who are in poverty. People who are maybe facing an illness or a job loss also draw on these ways of interpreting suffering. But listening to their narratives carefully helps allow a window into seeing how this way of interpreting suffering is lived in a social context of severe urban poverty and family homelessness. So Peggy, who was a 39-year-old white evangelical, she was the one who had been the house cleaner and who stopped attending after the congregation was unsupportive during her divorce, had long owned her own cleaning business, but went on welfare after she had an unplanned pregnancy in her late 30s. So she was a single mom in her late 30s when I met her in this study. And she said, "I see how my second child was of God's planning because I was never planning a pregnancy at that point in my life. But I see how much joy my child has brought and how God knew I was going to lose my mother. And I think God gave me my son to keep me going and to keep perspective on his plan for my life." And so she goes on to talk about how, here she is, she used to own her own business, she finds herself on welfare, which she found particularly stigmatizing after having been self-sufficient for so long. But she goes on to even see this as part of some greater plan. She said she wants to go back and talk to other women on welfare once she's successful, and how that God is guiding her. And instead of viewing these difficult events as she might have viewed them, she sees them part of God's plan for her life. So, one, suffering as part of God's plan, very common. In fact, the most common way that women interpreted their suffering. So even becoming homeless and having to move to a shelter, women would reinterpret in a more favorable light. Like, I lost my apartment, but now with the help of the shelter workers, I'm getting a better apartment. So that's part of God's plan for me. Or one particularly enthusiastic evangelical actually spoke very highly of the new opportunities living in the shelter gave her to evangelize. Even me, as I was interviewing her. So I would have never met you, and, sharing her faith with me. So this idea of bigger part of God's plan. 2, suffering as an opportunity for character development and growth. So Peggy told me that welfare mothers have stronger characters than wealthy married mothers because they have to struggle more, and so through this struggle, their stronger characters have been developed. And then finally, and this wasn't too common, but among some particularly devout women, this notion of sharing in the sufferings of Jesus. Just connecting it with Jesus' suffering. So a woman, Jane, who I mentioned before, a 40-year-old devout, born-again evangelical Christian with 4 children, she stopped attending church services when she became homeless, and her congregation wouldn't help at all with her difficulties. They also moved away from their regular congregation due to transportation issues, but she felt very alienated from her congregation after becoming homeless. And she interprets her homelessness and poverty as sharing in Jesus' suffering and that of the early disciples. She said, God says you have to deal with trials and tribulations. And she goes on and talks about the sufferings of Jesus and the early disciples, and saying, it's not an easy life to live, and this is part of walking the Christian walk. A few women mentioned that their suffering made them feel angry with God. But they would usually mention this in context of past anger or an anger they had worked through. More often they were trying to draw on their suffering and interpret it in sort of theologically positive, I guess, for lack of a better word. Some saw anger with God as something to pray about or a temptation from the devil. But what was bothersome to me was what individualistic notions of suffering women held. So, for example, they became homeless in their minds not because they lived in a really expensive city that lacks affordable housing for its low-income residents, but because, in some way, this was part of God's plan for them. Feminist, Black, liberation theologians have strongly critiqued these notions of redemptive suffering from which poor urban single mothers draw upon. They contend that these traditional theological explanations glorify suffering in ways that are unhelpful especially to Black and Latino women, and inhibit social change. But I would contend that for very poor single mothers, they're overwhelmed with daily concerns, they don't have a place to live, they're struggling to care for their children, they're disconnected from churches. The transformation that they seek of suffering is not in social action, but it is in the realm of daily personal life. And from their own point of view, their beliefs on suffering seem to help them to be more able to act in the midst of oppressive circumstances. So not to suggest that their explanations for suffering were unproblematic or that social change is unimportant, but to highlight that from their point of view, very poor women interpret suffering in ways that give them hope and ability to act. So you might ask why a lot of these conventionally religious women aren't in congregations. I didn't find many people with sort of New Agey beliefs. They were very traditional religious beliefs in many ways, and many people read scripture, or Catholic women might reference sacraments. I mean, kind of traditional ways of understanding religion. But there were 2 main reasons why they were not involved in congregations. One, pretty common sense, logistical. If you live in a shelter, if you've got a lot of little kids, it can be difficult. You might lack transportation. It's difficult to get to church for some women. The second reason, stigma, was more problematic, because about 1/3 of the people I interviewed felt stigmatized and unwanted in churches, either because of being poor, not having nice clothes, not having nice things to wear, not having money to put in the collection basket, being unmarried mothers, being divorced, you name it. People felt stigmatized and unwanted by churches. And all of the pastors that I interviewed were aware that this stigmatization existed, either in their own congregation or in others, due to either kind of these lifestyle issues or poverty. And one pastor I interviewed of a working class African American church told me that some of his church members don't want the poor and will come flat out and say it. He said one woman said to him, "Reverend, why is that all we can attract? The alcoholics and the drug addicts and the people who just got out of jail? What can they do for us? I mean, they can't give us collection. They're uneducated, so what can they do for us?" And he went on to continue. He said, "There's an issue among church members that we've struggled long and hard, and we've managed to make it, and you haven't, and that's your shame." And he said, "I think there's a whole element that this idea that we want to keep this away from our children. You know, we don't want them here." With regard to single motherhood and cohabitation, a single mother raised Catholic told me she tried to get her baby baptized, and the priest refused to baptize her baby. And she said, "The church I grew up in disappointed me, so I don't want to go to that church no more. The priest told me it takes a man and a woman to conceive a child, and it takes a man and a woman to raise a child. That's the first time I swore at someone of the cloth." So she actually was able to find another parish to baptize her baby, and that's certainly not Catholic teaching that you wouldn't baptize a child of an unmarried mother, but this was an experience she had in the parish that she grew up in, up around Boston. So to draw some conclusions, everyday religion is important for many mothers in poverty, including the many who do not attend religious services. Consistent with prior research on non-poor people, religion was more often drawn upon in positive ways, helpful rather than harmful ways, among the women I interviewed. Hope, resilience, persistence, ability to act, but there were also harmful religious interpretations, mainly in how some women drew on religion to see themselves. You know, this sort of God would think I'm a bum, or God sees me doing nothing. Poor women sometimes experience struggles such as feeling abandoned by God, which likely exacerbate already difficult situations. While supportive congregations can play a positive role in women's lives, churches can also be the backdrop for incidents of stigma and rejection, perceived and real, which increase stress and depression. And women sometimes draw on religious beliefs or ideas to interpret their own situations in unhelpful ways, compounding their guilt and shame when they don't meet societal expectations, things about not working, being on welfare, or issues of motherhood. So this, mixing up, as historian Marie Griffith talks about, this conflating God's view with societal norms can kind of put a double whammy on people as far as feeling stressed, shamed, and guilty. I guess I'll just say that my research looks at religion in the lives of mothers in urban poverty. This focus no means obscures the need for religious social justice, for religious organizations to try to make positive social change, better societal commitment toward the poor. But I argue that it's still important to understand from a micro level how women experience religion in their daily lives. I mean, people don't normally think of a welfare office or a low-wage service job as a site for the practice of religion, unless maybe you're thinking about the generous shelter volunteer or something like that, the welfare caseworker. But really, for those on the other end, those people needing the services and the people needing the welfare offices, those places can be just as much, if not more so, sites of everyday religion. And this could be more for the Q&A, but I'll give you some of my thoughts of implications for churches. So I'll say, first of all, no matter how important women find personal faith and prayer in helping them to persevere and go on, they're still disconnected from a network of religious support. for practical, emotional, and spiritual problems. And the counterexamples posed by the few women in my study who were involved with churches make it clear that personally religious poor women who are embedded in supportive religious congregations have many more resources, and other resources, in dealing with their challenges. This was well illustrated in my research by the case of a woman I called Maggie, a 32-year-old white Catholic single mom of 3-year-old and 10-year-old daughters. She attends Mass a couple of times a week. She's very devout. She participates in a Bible study that's run by her church to help people in their challenges with parenting. She feels very welcomed. She lives near the community. She receives strong encouragement from her parish priest about her goal of getting a GED and getting a job working with special needs children. And she told me, she said, I was having a really bad time struggling with depression and stuff, and I sometimes feel like there's no way I'm going to make it. It's a goal, and sometimes I feel like I'm not going to do it. It's just that the church helps me to feel like I can do it. So, while on the surface her remarks don't sound that different from the people who say God and their faith helps them feel like they can do it, Maggie's sense that the church helps her feel like she can do it reveals the myriad of church-based supports available to her. So, for example, she receives tremendous social, material, and spiritual support from her church, but she receives it as a member of the congregation, not as some needy other coming as with the handout at the food bank. Not to dismiss that. That's very important that we have that. But it's a really different relationship when you're embraced as a member of a community, as opposed to being the charity recipient. I was also struck by how isolated many of these women seemed. So a woman I called Rebecca, a 32-year-old white Catholic single mother of 2 girls who had survived domestic violence, she was practically crying out for the sense of belonging that she wishes she could find in a church congregation. She's the one that told me she feels guilt, disgust, remorse over not working and being on public assistance. She goes to Mass half the year because in New England the weather is good half the year and bad half the year, unlike you fortunate inhabitants of North Carolina. And so she only goes to Mass when the weather's good because she's taking little kids and she has to walk, which isn't easy in the snow. She prays and reads the Bible nightly with her daughters to teach them about faith. But when she goes to Mass, she interacts with no one, including the pastor, because she feels ashamed. And she said, I grew up without a family. And she said, she goes on to say, I have no family. My parents divorced. We didn't have a larger family. If you've been a transient, if you've lived here, there, you've lived in a shelter, it's very hard to sustain normal relationships. And she said, I see people who are very close with their church. They know people in their church. If they need someone to babysit their kid, they can trust a church member. It's not necessarily their family, but it's their community. And she said, I've never had that. She's really longing for that sense of community. She's personally quite religious. She longs for deep relationships and a sense of community. But her sense of isolation, guilt, and self-blame is really palpable. And although she's actually a lot more involved in churches than most of the people I studied, because she does attend half the year, she essentially is practicing an isolated form of religion. And I thought, surely there's got to be better ways to connect the churches across the U.S. with the Rebeccas across the U.S. Sociologist Omar McRoberts studied churches in a poor part of Dorchester, up in the Boston area, and found that although there were a lot of churches in the neighborhood, few of them included neighborhood residents, and actually a lot of them were even afraid of neighborhood residents and kind of were there for the cheap rent, things like that. I certainly don't lay all the blame at the feet of the churches, because some residents of poor urban neighborhoods feel a strong cultural distance from churches, feeling like, and survey data backs this up too, feeling like they're places not for people like us. They're for stuck-up people, or fearing that they'll be rejected. So I don't blame the churches per se in a one-way direction, because there's cultural differences too that cause people to hold themselves away from the church. But I do think that many of the churches could do a better job at including the poor, and so did most of the pastors that I interviewed. Doing this research also raised for me just some general questions about how the middle class often has very little interaction with the very poor, due in part to residential economic segregation in our community. All right, when I first started doing this research, I was living in a city environment, and my kids had a lot of opportunity to interact with people from all sorts of economic backgrounds. But as I was writing the research up, a few years down the road, I was, living in a kind of upper middle class suburb, and just the shock of you're only around people of your same economic background, and you never have any interaction with the poor almost whatsoever. Including in the churches, and these women's voices who I'd interviewed were really kind of haunting me, as I was experiencing this. The fact that many churches are more likely to view the poor as charity recipients rather than equal members matters not primarily because church participation could help meet poor people's needs, although I do argue that in the book. Although I say that's an important and positive side benefit. But it suggests it matters because the poor are our brothers and sisters in the human family, our brothers and sisters in faith for religious believers, equal in the eyes of God. I think I will leave questions related to public policy for the questions and answers, and perhaps also questions about my own sort of faith experiences and how they've driven why I chose to study what I study. So I'll end there and turn it over to questions.